One thing that people don't always think about is the world of cognitive performance. Like what makes us tick? What makes us drive forward to do something? And on this channel, we're generally talking about performance, we're talking about nutrition, but I wanted to start bridging the gap between performance, nutrition, the brain, how it all comes together. So I've got with me someone that I am a huge fan of, Mr. Chris Voss. Chris Voss is an author of a book called Never Split the Difference. He was one of the chief crisis negotiators for the FBI for a number of years. So Chris, I'll let you explain a little bit who you are, then we can get into some fun stuff.
Yeah, I'm a deeply flawed human, that's who I am. No, I'm originally a Midwesterner. I grew up in a small town in Iowa, son of Richard and Joyce Voss, town of 7,000 people, blue collar family. Ended up with the FBI. I was a cop before that. For a variety of twists and turns in life, became a hostage negotiator. Loved it. Before hostage negotiation, I was on a SWAT team. And that was a part of the twists and turns, knee injuries, if you will. And then it was become a hostage negotiator. It was awesome. Loved it. Loved doing something to actually help people in bad times.
Yeah. And
then that evolved, and trying to get better at hostage negotiation, I started collaborating with Harvard. And then the Harvard guys said, you're doing the same thing we are. Stakes are different, but the dynamics are the same. And so I decided to get into coaching business negotiation. And, as you said before, cognitive performance.
Yeah.
Negotiation, Jim Camp used to say negotiation is a human performance event.
There you go.
And so it's about performance. And now if you want to get better at negotiation or anything else in life, you start to get into cognitive performance and neuroscience and everything that goes with it.
So with what you are doing now, focusing on what you're doing now, I guess, do you have somewhat of an emphasis on a little bit of the biochemistry or the neuroscience behind it? And it's okay if you say no, I'm just curious.
No, we talk about it all the time.
Really? Nice.
Yeah, because the neurochemicals are the most powerful, most addicting chemicals that are out there. Stephen Kotler, the guy who wrote The Rise of Superman, I think he said flow is the most addicting drug on earth. I mean, people, more addicting than anything. And people are dying as a result in their pursuit of flow on a regular basis. So those are, you're high on you. It affects your mental performance. You can get behind that. You can start changing how much you enjoy life and how well you live it.
Interesting, yeah, because I just, some might have seen the videos, but I was just out in Tampa with Dr. Dom D'Agostino, who's a professor of neuropharmacology, but his main emphasis is in ketones and in that whole world. And we were talking about just this, and we're just getting to an interesting part of everything now, where there's this cerebral side that people kind of think about, but then there's also this more tangible, almost pragmatic side that you can start making changes externally too. So what I like about how Chris focuses on these things, how you focus on these things, is you really work from almost the inside out. I tend to work from the outside in terms of what could be additive. How can we make the brain perform better through nutrition, through you name it. Whereas you're a very interesting individual because you really know what makes people tick. And that's just, it brings up a slew of just a bunch of different questions that I really want to go into. So we'll get into those in a little bit. But I've noticed, I obviously follow you on Instagram. I'm a big fan of yours. So I noticed, you're doing red light therapy. You're focused on these things about your health. You're very health focused, and you're obviously fit. So are you doing things right now? And again, maybe they're unbeknownst to you, but are you starting to make changes in terms of how you live your life, in terms of your nutrition, in terms of health? Are you doing things in particular to focus on longevity, all that piece?
You can get 25% off of Thrive Market, which is an online grocery store. So for low carb, for paleo, for anything, all organized by diet category, 25% off. Awesome deal. So you get 25% off your first grocery order with Thrive, plus get a free gift. You've got to check them out. So groceries get delivered right to your doorstep, super easy and convenient. Got Thomas DeLauer's stamp of approval on just about all the products that are in the lower carb keto category. So definitely worth checking out. It has made my life so much easier, and I hope that you can give it a shot too. It's really awesome stuff, and a big thank you to them. So that link down below.
Oh yeah, I'm always doing stuff to tweak that. I think we're on, which you probably do too. I think we're on the verge. If you live 20 more years at all, and you don't destroy your health in the meantime, you're going to live at least 40 or 50 more years, no matter how old you are.
Yeah.
I think the right now the barrier is kind of 120-ish.
Yeah.
And I think we're on the verge of figuring that out and breaking through that barrier easily. And I still got bad habits.
Yeah. Of course.
I don't eat right all the time, and I'll knock down the occasional bourbon.
Yeah.
Maybe more than occasional. But I'm definitely interested in longevity, and not just longevity. There's a discussion now whether or not there's a trade-off between longevity and vitality. I'm not willing to make that trade-off.
Yeah.
I think they're going to solve that too. But so I'm constantly tweaking.
Yeah.
And I'll try stuff just flat out. If there's any study that substantiates it at all, then I'm going to give it a shot and see if it has an effect. And there's more studies coming online all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in enjoying my life more, having more fun, getting more.
Yeah.
Not at somebody else's expense unless they're a bad guy.
Yeah.
And there are bad guys out there in business and in life.
Yeah.
Got no problem crushing the bad guys. My son and I joke about it a lot because my son runs my company, Brandon. He's a better negotiator than I am. Hey, he had to be, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But when we were talking about the core values of the company before a couple of years ago, and I was talking about as a hostage negotiator, I always view kidnappers and terrorists as bullies. And one of the things I loved about the negotiation strategy was it was a way for me to get at the bullies.
Yeah.
Not only save hostages, but also just create something that would be very punitive against the terrorists.
Yeah.
And hound them afterwards, after the siege, gather enough evidence. If it's a kidnapping, gather enough evidence. Because in a kidnapping overseas, they're going to walk away from the immediate siege.
Yeah.
But the U.S. has a long memory. And so let's get enough evidence so we can indict them and find them and bring justice to them, as Bush said a long time ago. Bring terrorists to justice or justice to the terrorists.
Yep.
And to me, it was about getting at bullies. And then also applying that in business negotiation. There are a lot of bullies in business. So my son's giving me a hard time about that a couple of years ago. Like, I don't know, we're not necessarily getting after bullies. And then we're coaching a company. He's coaching a company that's being bullied by a very high-profile businessman. And he's going on and on about how we're going to back these guys up. We're going to give them the tactics because they're being bullied. And I'm like, wait, hold. I thought you told me you didn't want to kick the bully's ass. And now that is exactly what you're doing.
Yep.
And he kind of went like, okay.
That's awesome. And I think that comes into play even in everyday life, right? Like even with little hurdles here and there, I think you're still getting after bullies. I mean, you really are. I mean, and I guess it comes down to where your motivations once again, right? If you're someone that's wired like you, where you're saying, hey, yeah, I want to get after bullies. Do you find the bullies in everyday life even at a kind of nano level? Like, and I mean that almost rhetorically. If there's maybe a person isn't the bully, but it's almost a trait of wanting to conquer in a way and wanting to do good. And how does that apply even for daily life? Like if someone's wired that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, it always gave me more purpose and made, ideally, the endeavors are a privilege versus an obligation. And then some of the fine line is, like, who's acting badly, but it's very defensive. They don't mean to be one of the bad guys. They don't mean to be vindictive.
Yeah.
Sorting out that behavior can be challenging occasionally. I could overreact to somebody who's just having a bad day.
Yeah.
Or they just don't know any better. Or they think they got to do that because, as somebody set a bad example. So, if you're really sort of attacking the negative behavior versus a person, you can sort that out a little bit. And then time will tell whether or not their heart is in the wrong place.
Interesting.
And if their heart's in the wrong place, we just mostly we cut them out, we walk away from them, we don't want to do business with them.
Yeah.
There's no point in going back after somebody whose heart's in the wrong place if they're no longer a problem.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting point because everything that you train within your systems with Black Swan Group and everything like that, I think are directly applicable to everyday life too. Like down to the nuancy stuff of what gets me up in the morning to go work hard in the gym, what gets me going to do what I do on camera or to be a certain way with my family. And I think that's really the message that I'm trying to get across overall is like cognitive performance isn't just about going into an extreme situation.
Right.
It really is even how you hold yourself and being aware. And some of the things I talk about all the time, I talk about what's called network stability, which is, there's a lot of evidence in the world of ketones and network stability, which is essentially the ability for the brain to be able to, regions of the brain to communicate fluently with one another. Whereas when you have a bolus of glucose in the brain, basically the brain becomes loud, for lack of a better term. And the brain typically likes to work in a sense of like whispering to one another, where it needs to be quiet and calm for those regions of the brain to be able to all communicate and for that signal transduction to really work. So it's
you haven't studied this, have you?
What's up? Not at all. I only do like 6 videos a week on it, right?
Yeah,
so
very nice.
It's very interesting because that is being able to have that calm, relaxed brain is a fast brain, and there are ways to get that way via nutrition, but there's also probably even more appropriate ways to get there through training.
Yeah.
And again, that's what I appreciate so much. And just sort of as an anecdotal thing, I mean, how I learned about Chris was I was going through a situation where a brand was using my name and face all the time, and they were just kind of exploiting my name, and I had to take legal action against them. And I was actually willing to kind of back down on some of the settlement stuff, and it was my attorney that said, "No, I'm going to send you this book." And that's how I learned about you. And anyhow, personal story, but I kind of want to dive into the performance piece for a little bit. When you were with the Bureau and you were going into a situation, was there any kind of like pre-performance routine or anything? Like, so let's say you have an emergency, you have a crisis you have to deal with. Maybe, I don't know what it would typically look like. Maybe it's a couple hours, maybe it's 5 hours before you get there, whatever. What would you do to get your head on straight? Were there any nutritional tactics you would use? Anything? Like, what was your pregame?
Yeah, well, I'm old enough that we didn't have a lot of great nutritional mechanisms that we were aware of when I was a hostage negotiator, but the pregame really was, we start collaborating as a team. Like, you want to go fast, go alone, you want to go far, go as a team.
Yeah.
And how much could we prep for the predictable aspects of the conversation as a team in advance?
Yeah.
Now, there was one of the guys that I worked with that I really learned from, a guy named Byron Sage. And Byron was actually the voice that spoke to the people at Waco.
Okay.
Now, there were a lot of people involved at Waco. My former boss, Gary Nessner, ran the overall negotiation operation. Byron happened to be assigned to Texas out of the Austin RA, and he was the guy that, he spoke directly to either Koresh or Koresh's number 2.
Okay.
And he was so effective. Byron actually had a face-to-face with Koresh's number 2. He had such an impact on the guy. The guy goes walking back into the compound, and Koresh sees that his number 2 guy has been strongly influenced by Byron. And Koresh never let that guy talk to Byron ever again. That's how good Byron was. Okay. So then I started working more directly with him, and he started talking about sieges when they were on a hunt for a bad guy, and they were preparing for it to turn into a siege. And Byron stands up the negotiation operations cell, and then they start talking about all the predictable dialogue and what they're going to say in advance. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, like, that's brilliant. The team is getting ready in advance to basically mentally rehearse for what some of the challenges would be. Get their repetitions in. My son now, Brandon, likes to say, get your preps and reps in. Do your preparation, get your mental repetitions in advance.
Yeah.
And I was really inspired by that. So anytime that we were getting ready to deploy into anything, I started bouncing ideas off the team that's working with me, whether it's just one other person or whether we got a whole group of guys. And we start kicking the ideas around, we kind of get into sync, and then the brain gets into gear and we become creative with each other.
Interesting. Yeah, so that's, really being able to, getting the bugs out of your mouth too, so to speak. Really just getting everything flowing. Because I would imagine there's probably never really a situation where you're just going to be cold dropped into a situation with zero time to think about it. Maybe in other aspects of the Bureau, but as far as your role was concerned, did you almost always have a little bit of prep, maybe even ranging from 30 minutes to if you had to go overseas or anything like that?
There would always be enough time to start getting your head around it. And once you've done it a few times, of course, you're going to get your head around it faster, because then there are predictable patterns. Like, one of the reasons why we really came out of hostage negotiation and business negotiation was, we were taught the other side's going to be driven by loss.
Yeah.
Like no matter what kind of siege it is, whether it's a spontaneous, there's basically three kinds of sieges: spontaneous, planned for, and prepared for.
Okay.
And they run very specific lengths of time. I can't remember, there was a siege that was on TV recently. CNN reached out to me, and they said, look, we'd like to schedule it for Monday night. And this is like 48 hours away. And I go, well, you can schedule me for Monday night, but this thing's going down in 12 hours.
Yeah.
And it's gonna be over. And they were like, yeah, sure it is. And it was done 12 hours later because I knew the profile of the siege.
Yeah.
And they emailed me back and they were like, wow, how'd you know? And I know the earmarks of the siege.
Yeah.
So you go through the dynamics enough times, you begin to see what the profile, what the time frame is gonna be. And then what's gonna drive the people inside. It's always gonna be a sense of loss.
Yeah.
Some sense of loss is always gonna be driving a behavior. So then, just before I get out, 2002, Danny Kahneman wins a Nobel Prize for prospect theory, behavioral economics, Nobel Prize, that loss thinks twice as much as an equivalent gain for all human nature.
Yep.
All
Yeah, that was going to be my
ALL.
next question. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what you eat, doesn't matter what your religion is. You know, one of the things I like to joke about, you know, tactical empathy is so effective it even works on vegans. That's effective.
Perfect.
So, but we understood the triggers in hostage negotiation, crisis negotiation, and we thought it was just hostage negotiation.
Yeah.
And then as the more and more information gets shared through the early 2000s up to today, everybody's saying, no, this is human nature, this is human behavior, period. And then now, as the neuroscience performance that you're talking about, we got neuroscience that we didn't have 10 years ago.
Yep.
And we find that, again, this affects human beings, period, regardless of gender, ethnicity, geographical upbringing, anything else. It's how people are wired.
So you think that fear of loss really drives, I mean, not just, can it drive our traits too? I mean, because in a way, traits are sort of just, almost just fabricated forms of our behaviors, right? I mean, like we develop traits.
Right.
What is a trait, right? Is a trait just something that you've kind of, I envision a trait as this rut that I've dug in clay in a canyon from my habits, right?
Right.
Like, is a trait something you're born with? I don't know. That's a kind of a random question, but that fear of loss, I've recognized that, I mean, a lot of my motivations come from a fear of loss. They really do. I mean, I think, and it's really what drives me. And I think coming to terms with that can actually be a very beneficial thing. You know, like why do I strive to look a certain way? Why do I strive to maintain a certain level of health, physique? Is it the fear of loss of losing something else? Or so it's pretty interesting. You find that almost all fundamental behavior is rooted back in that?
Yeah. Short answer is yes. You know, there's a fair amount of debate over sort of degrees of impact. So, what we'll say is it's the single biggest driver. It doesn't mean it's the only driver.
Yeah.
And, before I started hearing about neuroscience, we'd hear from different psychologists. Somebody would contend that all behavior is driven by fear.
Yeah.
And other psychologists would contend all behavior is driven by either fear or love. Fear is still a big one. And fear of what? Fear of loss.
Yep.
And Kahneman and Tversky came up with the theory, which a lot of other psychologists supported. They were a couple of interesting cats, and just from what I've read about them, Tversky, his partner, would have won the Nobel Prize as well, but he was deceased by the time it was delivered. Danny Kahneman makes no bones about the fact that that's the only reason that Amos Tversky didn't get it also. But these were a couple of interesting cats. And there's you can read really hard. His book, Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a heavy read. Yeah. Danny Kahneman is an in-depth, complicated thinker. And maybe for me, in-depth, complicated reads are a lot because when I read, my lips get tired, so I can't read really big, long books. Boom, boom, a lot of comedy here.
Yeah.
But they're worth learning about, and these were two disruptive guys too. Like they were only interested in what worked, and so for the longest time they were heretics, and which they loved.
Yeah.
And then when suddenly they went from being heretics to being the status quo that everybody wanted to argue with, that kind of caught them off guard too.
Yeah, true.
So, but again, the original question was fear of loss.
Yeah.
So it's the biggest driver. It's not the only driver. It's where you start with, though, if you want to influence behavior.
Yeah.
Let's start with what matters most.
And I think a lot of people that watch my channel, whether they're focused on cognitive performance or not, they're either going through or they've gone through some kind of physical transformation, right? And the questions that they ask themselves are, well, just how do I keep motivated? And people ask me that all the time, right? After my weight loss, how do I stay motivated and keep doing what I'm doing? And sometimes I don't really have an answer because I just like the process and I just deal with it. But when you're talking to someone that's really just trying to maintain motivation and trying to keep that momentum going for themselves, understanding, okay, there's a fear of loss situation at play, like if that can help you learn how you continue to do what you need to do, I could see in some ways it might cripple people, right? They don't want to necessarily know that they're scared of losing something or fear of losing something or having to really work backwards into their childhood as to like what are they fearful of losing that maybe they had in their childhood or what was brought to them. But I sincerely believe that for longevity of being able to like maintain physical fitness and being able to maintain and push yourself to a high degree for a long period of time, because there's only so much willpower, right? That's the thing that I really focus on. There's only so much willpower that you can borrow from. Like you can't do that forever. Like when you're young and you have vitality, like we talked about, I find it with myself. I'm in my mid-30s, I've got a couple of kids, and now it's like, yeah, you start feeling the weight of the world and you have kids and you realize I can't just prefrontal cortex my way through life all the time. At some point I need to understand what is firing, what is happening in the amygdala that's allowing me so I can tap into that to keep that motivation going. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
No, completely. I think, and we talked about this a little bit just before we sat down. The first step is being aware what your motivation is. Yeah. What's driving you. Sort of the second step is don't be fooled by if what you're doing is working for you, which is if it's necessarily the best thing. And what do I mean by that? Emotions sometimes a little bit like rock, paper, scissors. So when you're in the depths of despair, and I do this intentionally on myself, I know the fastest thing that'll soak up my despair and sadness is anger. I mean, I could instantaneously lift myself. I can lift myself out of the depths with anger. I can feel it happen. I watch and I wait for the neurochemicals to hit my system.
Interesting.
And because I'm my own science project.
Yeah.
So I pay attention to how the neurochemicals hit me. And I know that anger lifts me out of the depths of despair if I need to be lifted.
That anger drive, yeah.
However, I can never reach the height of my performance through anger.
Yeah.
And if you don't know that, you will think, well, all I got to do to be my best is to be angry, because your comparison is you were an F student and you moved yourself to a B minus, and you say, look at the distance I covered by getting angry. That I've never done that before. I gotta be angry. You don't know because you've never seen your A+ behavior. And you'll stop at B minus, never knowing the A+. Flow is largely positive.
Yeah.
Borderline euphoria.
Yeah. Yep.
And if you don't find a way to find that out, then you'll hit the ceiling with anger. Now, conversely, as powerful as flow is, high positivity, I can't pull myself out of the depths as instantaneously. I could do some gratitude exercises. Sometimes it works. Sometimes I got to sit in it, and I do gratitude exercises. I do a whole bunch. I do all that stuff because I want to improve my performance at all times.
100%, yeah.
But I've never lifted myself out of the depths of despair with gratitude as quickly as I have with anger.
Yeah.
I mean, and there was a guy, and I've since let it go, but there's a guy that the mere mention of his name used to infuriate me. And so if I was really sad, I would just think of his name, and boom, I'd be out of it. But then I, discovered a lot more about flow, thanks from Kotler and some other people. And I thought, all right, I'm limiting myself here with this behavior. So, your original question is, do you discover your motivation? Absolutely. And then discover what motivates people best, and then compare it. And then if you're interested in being at the top of your game, maybe you make adjustments along the way to get there, depending upon the circumstances.
And being self-aware, because if you're in the depths of despair and you're going to use anger drive to get you out of it, but if you don't know that you're in the depths of despair and you're not willing to come to terms and be okay with that, understanding where you're at, because I think a large population of people that maybe aren't in tune with themselves, they're flying status quo and they don't necessarily realize it, right? They don't know that they're down. And then someone tells them that they're down and they don't want to believe it or they don't want to listen to it, or no, I'm fine, I'm happy. So what does that do? That cattle progs them to force happy, which isn't really happy, and it doesn't work. And I'm the same way. The anger drive is great, and I've noticed that I've literally done videos on anger drive because there's quite a bit of neuroscience research on that. When people are angry, they can get through a lot of things, but that flow state doesn't happen out of anger, as you mentioned. But then you'll also have, on the other side of the coin, people that are going to be in the depths of despair, so they're going to try to get into flow state at that point in time, or they're going to try to fairy dust their way out of it because, all I got to do is be happy. All I got to do is be happy. I'm going to meditate and make myself happy. And it doesn't get you out of that. And I liken it to, because again, I'm a very tangible guy. Like, what do I do, in the morning if I'm sleepy, if I feel down? I literally jump in an ice bath, like a bath with ice. And there's a lot of obvious biochemical things that are going on there too that don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but talk about a state shift, right? And there's people that do that with breath. I'm not real good with the breath thing. I just haven't mastered it, but there's obviously people that are very good with that, can shift their state. But it fucking pisses me off when I get in a tub of cold water. I'm not happy, but it's like, F this, right? But at the same time, then you quickly kind of find some peace with it. But the point is, I think that state shift, and anger is a very applicable state shift for that. So it's such a good point. I think being able to, not necessarily peacefully get yourself out of these ruts, being able to jolt yourself out of them, does a number of things psychologically and neurochemically. So, okay, nowadays, or actually rather than nowadays, okay, back when you were, or even, I guess you could still say nowadays, even with what you're doing now, are there any sort of cognitive performance, I hate the word hacks, but I'm going to say it because it's colloquial and people understand. Are there things that you do, whether it's nutritionally, I noticed you're into red light therapy, you're into that, what are you, I consider you someone that is like the cream of the crop when it comes to cognitive performance.
Thank you.
So, what are some of, take me through what things that you would do?
Well, I got a daily gratitude exercise. I'm trying to reset gratitude. I also definitely think that there's, what we would refer to as karma. Science is slowly coming online to indicate that it actually exists scientifically. And I'm about every single edge that I could get. If there's an edge, when I was doing kidnapping negotiations, if we got somebody kidnapped and Al Qaeda's got them, or son of Al Qaeda, or son of Al Qaeda, because they morph about every 5 years, and it's a long shot that's probably going to work out. Like, I'll take slim over none every day. Like, I'm used to taking long shots, and you get used to long shots, and so okay, well, if it'll make things a little bit better, I'll try. And see how it affects me. So I'm trying to red light therapy right now, and there's some data coming online as to dosage and when and what time of day. And I'm constantly listening to that. But I do the gratitude exercise because I'm trying to make me better, and I think there's something to karma, and I'm putting out as much positive energy as possible, and I think it affects the positive things that come my way.
Agreed.
So, what else am I doing? I'm experimenting with nutrition. I'm trying to find out what to consume at what time of day. Some of the hard parts would be, what bad habits that I really like, that I just got to stop and go cold turkey on for a little while. So, fortunately, the dad on coffee's back and forth because I like my morning coffee. But, I'm constantly trying to tweak it because I want to live for a long time to come. And I want to, I want longevity and vitality. So I'm willing to do the experimental stuff. The only stuff that I've been very careful with the red light therapy on my eyes. And now there's some data that supports limited dosage of red light. And so I'm like, cool, I'll do that. But some of the rest of the stuff, as they say, first they experiment on thoroughbreds, then professional athletes, and then the rest of us, right?
Pretty much.
So I'm willing to go in on the thoroughbred stage early on.
You have to, man. You got to be your own N = 1. And I think, even the mantra of my channel is literally like, pursue results and then reinforce with science. Because sometimes you got to take some of the stuff that's a little bit fringe, and if it's not dangerous, test it. Because if we sat here and waited for peer-reviewed research to come out, then we'd all be 20 years behind on everything. right?
Right.
And that's one of the things.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the things I like about performance settings, professional athletes, military applications. Is they're typically willing to bet a little bit, and it's because if it's, I've always said, like, if there was a dog turd on the table and it would really make me a better performer if I ate it, I'd probably eat it. And it wouldn't be fun. But the point is that
I agree, man.
It's like I'm all about.
Don't be scared to try stuff.
I mean, a dog turd probably wouldn't be very fun. But the point is that you have to be.
Until somebody shows you the science, then you got a problem.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Shoot. But I guess my point with that is, being able to apply those kinds of things to yourself. I mean, you have nothing to lose, really, and especially if it's and even if it's somewhat placebo, if you got something out of it, then whatever, right?
And there's no such thing as a placebo now, too, because the science is backing that up, too.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. So it's so wild, and that's just where I get just so intrigued, because it's like, okay, is it the barrier of our mind and our psychology, or is it these extrinsic things that we are in, ergogenic aids and things that we're taking in? I think there's a balance, a delicate balance there of what works. I feel like we start to reach a limit of physical capability to a certain degree, right? But then you look at situations like the one that I reference all the time is Tony Hawk doing the 1080, right? Did the 1080, no one could do a 1080, and then what, in the subsequent 4, 5, 6 weeks, how many other people did 1080s, right? The belief system of really being able, once, like, the psychology itself is amazing, but like, where does psychology stop and neurochemistry start, or vice versa, right? Like, because it's easy to say, okay, if someone is the belief system, okay, well, I like to look more granular. What is happening in that belief system? What happened to someone's neurochemistry that is changing, that is now allowing them? Because previously, we didn't think it was physically possible to do a 1080. No, you can't sprint that many times. There's not enough torque. You can't get this, whatever. And then all of a sudden, now we exceed. I don't even know what we're doing now. 10 turns, like whatever it is. So it's just very intriguing to me. And then being able to find ways to support that, to do it for a very long period of time. Because then it comes down to, okay, I can do this once. Now how do I do it for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years?
Right. Yeah. And one of your questions was, where does psychology stop and neuroscience end?
Yeah.
I think psychology stops unless it takes neuroscience into account.
Yeah.
Like when I hear about somebody who's thinking about performance or communication, human interaction, if they're a psychologist and they're not changing their mind about ideas that they had 30 years ago, I don't even pay attention to them. I might look at the stuff they're talking about, and I'll make up my mind, but I won't agree with their conclusions. Now, the psychologists that want to be informed by neuroscience, these are interesting cats.
Yeah.
Because there's a real openness. I think neuroscience probably is a threat to psychology.
I can see that.
And psychology was as good as we could do before we could see in the brain.
Yep.
And now we can see in the brain.
Yeah.
And then there's still guys that are out there. We talked about placebo. Joe Dispenza.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, all right, so I imagined my back into place, and it went back into place.
Okay.
And you're like, and nobody had the science to back that up.
No.
Except he made it happen.
Yep.
So then, if you just start looking for that information, then life is an inspiring proposition.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's so interesting. And I mean, if we kind of couple that back, well, actually, I had a question I didn't want to forget, because you were talking about toying with nutrition, and this is bona fide curiosity. Have you messed around with fasting, intermittent fasting for that? Yeah. Do you see much of a, I mean, I was just talking to Dom DiAgostino in Florida about this. Obviously, it's his wheelhouse. I'm a big faster. People that watch my channel know that I am. The sense of calm, the sense of clarity that I get. Not everyone responds that way, because you do have a big catecholamine surge, adrenaline, epinephrine. So some people get more kind of amped up with it. But what was your experience with it?
All good.
Yeah.
Figuring out timing and dosages, different things like that. One of the things, you see a lot of people with PhDs behind their name passing around information that they have no idea whether or not it's any good.
Yeah.
And there's no way you're not following Andrew Huberman.
Yeah, of course, he's awesome.
One of the things I really learned by paying attention to him, as a general rule, PhD wants to be Jesus.
Yeah.
This is true because I said. And they're not checking on their data.
Yeah.
Now, Huberman checks on everything, and as you mentioned before, peer-reviewed research.
Yeah. Not
just research, but peer-reviewed, and is really going through the gauntlet. Now you can pay attention to that.
Yeah.
And so the information about fasting is all over the place.
Yeah.
From people with PhDs, and if you look real closely at it, there's no indication of where they got the information.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do fasting. I try it all because I also, one of the PhDs, and I would probably sound like I'm bad-mouthing, they wrote, look, I had a problem with my Achilles tendon and it never healed till I did a 7-day water fast.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know when that peer-reviewed research is going to come up, but healing of connective tissue and joints, which is extremely difficult, I'll try a 7-day water fast if that's what it's going to take.
Yeah.
So I'm trying the intermittent fasting or the extended fasting all the time.
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, I definitely find, from a cognitive side of things, and it's one thing, I think at least in the nutrition world, when you're pumping out a nutrition PhD or someone that's in that world, so much of the focus really does end up coming down to the weight loss piece. So it's very easy for that crowd to just say, okay, we just want to talk about thermodynamics and we only want to focus on the weight loss piece and that's it. So that discussion kind of ends there. But then there's all these other pieces that we're talking about, cognitive function. And when you're fasting for not necessarily extended periods of time, because it's different from individual to individual, but you get to a point where you are starting to produce ketone bodies, that has a tremendous, very well documented effect in the brain in terms of gamma aminobutyric acid, in terms of GABA, that glutamate GABA ratio, and kind of what's allowed to enter the brain and what's allowed to go through what's called the NMDA receptor, and it changes that whole dynamic. So there's a fair bit of evidence there. Now, that's not to say that people aren't bio-individual and they're not going to have individual responses, right?
Right.
But yeah, for people to say that it's not going to work is a pretty cold, hard statement to make when there's peer-reviewed evidence, but also like a lot of anecdotal experience, a lot of anecdotal evidence. I just mentioned that and didn't want to go on a fasting, rant or anything like that. But I definitely feel, with the military applications, law enforcement applications that I've worked with, intermittent fasting ends up becoming, because you can't always get people to subscribe to a ketogenic diet.
Right.
Just because people don't necessarily want to give up their carbs. B, there's some stigma associated with it in certain ways, especially in our media right now. It's just difficult. With intermittent fasting, you at least put yourself in a spot where you're not taking away people's specific vices in certain foods, right? You're just setting up a timing system. So it's an easier barrier to entry to talk to people.
Right.
And then you can open up the discussion on, well, how do you feel with that?
Hell, even vegans will fast, right?
Yeah, well, that's what's kind of funny is like I talk to all walks of life on my channel, and what's really funny is the vegan thing. Patricia Bragg, remember, Bragg's Aminos and that, like the apple cider vinegar and everything like that. She was talking about fasting, in the 60s, 70s, right? And it's so funny because actually the vegan community really, as far as publicity goes, they're the ones that really brought fasting to be openly talked about as a dietary trend. And then somewhere along the lines, it still exists, but it got overshadowed and it was much louder coming from sort of the metabolic health community and the ketogenic community, because the underlying, when you're in a state of fasting, you're producing ketones. So there's that common denominator to talk about fasting and ketosis in the same vein, when in reality, it's, vegans have been talking about fasting for a long time. So it's just funny, the world and the dogmatism that happens in nutrition. It's like when you get down to the grassroots of it, a lot of us are really going after the same damn thing. We really are.
Right.
And it's just, I think it's a huge disservice. That's a whole different story, right? If we're talking about performance, like who are we to sit in one camp and say this is better than the other when it's weaponizing it, being able to take a tool and use it. And not everyone wants to think like that, right? Like I look at nutrition as that way. Like sometimes carbohydrates work well for me, so that is a weaponized application for whatever I'm doing at that point in time. Same thing if I want to go cognitive. If I'm going to be filming, you bet your bottom dollar that I'm going to be, at least keto for 3 or 4 days leading up to a big filming session, because absolutely,
You're interested in performance, period.
Precisely. And it's like, people will say, oh, you're a keto zealot. I don't care. If the science changed today and you told me that I was going to get better performance by eating bananas and cream cheese, I'd probably eat the bananas and cream cheese.
No, I agree. Be agnostic about the philosophy.
Yeah.
Let me focus on what works. If I got to think about philosophy after the fact, all right, well, we'll take that into account, but then it becomes almost a shrill conversation.
Yeah.
But let's focus on what works first.
Exactly. So where would you say, you talked about the bullying piece, the bully piece, but where would you say your motivations lie today? Because first of all, Chris is probably analyzing every little bit of my body language. Probably knows more about me now than I know about myself, and I can't help but get that out of the back of my head this whole time, thinking like, what's Thomas doing with his fingers? Oh, that means he's nervous. Oh, anyway. But where do your motivations lie? Because so much of what you do is about assessing motivations and what drives people. Have they changed? Have you identified them? Do you even know?
Well, we like helping people get better.
Yeah.
We like discovering new stuff. I mean, when I was in the FBI, I loved being on the cutting edge of whatever was being done.
Yeah.
You know, we liked being out there in front of everybody else. Like, and I was, you know, I'm old, right? Relatively speaking. But the first World Trade Center bombing, 1993, there were a bunch of us inside the FBI that were saying, terrorism is here, this is a problem. Everybody in the FBI and the NYPD said there was no terrorism in the United States. The Joint Terrorist Task Force was actually in the process of being dismantled when the first World Trade Center bombing hit, which is many pointed to the birth of Al-Qaeda. Like 9/11, the guy that put 9/11 together is the uncle of the guy that did the 93 bombing, literally his uncle. So in 93, we'd actually been reassigned. The FBI said, and the NYPD, the police detectives were being reassigned. The FBI said, you no longer work in terrorism. You guys are now working gang crimes. We got heat from the politicians. We got funding for gang crimes. You guys are now working gang crimes. And we went, really? Well, as it turns out, all of our terrorist groups qualify as gangs. So we simply changed the titles to the case.
Yeah.
But the point that I'm making is we were out there in front of what we believed in and plowing completely new ground.
Yeah.
Which also means there's a real lack of bureaucratic rules.
Yes.
You're really guided by morality at that point because your bureaucracy isn't caught up. And I always loved being out on the cutting edge, ahead of the bureaucracy, plowing new ground, but guided by your own morality.
Yeah.
What do we do now? We're plowing new ground, completely new ground in negotiation. And we are out there in front of the bureaucrats, and we test our own stuff, because if we don't negotiate well, we don't make a living. Most of our competitors are attached to universities, and they get paid no matter what. You know, the negotiation training is sort of a side thing that they do because it's fun.
Yeah.
But if we are not good at what we do, we fail and it gets out. And so within our discipline of tactical empathy, we're on the cutting edge. And we're coming up with new stuff within our framework and we're helping people get better at what they're doing. And we're coming up with dynamics, you know, as a team. I was talking about this with the team the other day, because now they want to call me Kreskin. You know, everybody got different nicknames. Kreskin was, you know, the guy who could supposedly read people's minds.
Yep.
And I'm telling the guys a story the other day, because I'm working a kidnapping, it's a Haitian kidnapping, but it didn't matter because I know the time markers on every kidnapping in a profile.
Yeah.
So I show up, I'm working this kidnapping, and I go, all right, today's Monday. Here's what they're gonna say tomorrow, on Tuesday. Now they're just gonna make really vague threats, and they're gonna chill out a little bit on Wednesday, then they're gonna start getting to get a little bit more serious on Thursday, and the threats are gonna become more specific, and they're gonna really want this to go down because they wanna go drinking on Saturday night. I mean, the first time I found out that criminal kidnappers like to party on Saturday night, I was just blown away by that. But that's a human nature dynamic.
Yeah.
And so I began to understand the dynamics. Now I thought this was kidnapping 101. And on Tuesday, when the threats came across the phone exactly as I said they were gonna be, they were like, this guy's the amazing Kreskin. He can see what's coming. He knew what they were gonna say before they said it. And I was thinking, like, this is just, I've done this enough times, I know the patterns. So now that what we're teaching people in negotiation, we say, all right, here's what we want you to say, and here's one of 3 responses that you're gonna get. And it goes down that way because we do it enough ourselves.
Yeah.
And then people go like, holy cow, you know, you guys can see the future. Well, we are into this.
Yeah.
So we're helping people who are making a better living for themselves and their families.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with making a really good living. Yeah. Now, if that's your only motivation, then it's questionable because you got the money.
Yep.
But if your religion is making the world a better place, giving your kids a nicer house, a better education, creating a future for other people. And we like helping those people.
Yeah.
Now, there are a lot of people with bad motivation in business. We don't help them.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's such a good way of putting it, because money, I've always viewed money as kind of a way of keeping score versus a motivation, right? It's like it's a scorecard. Like it's not something that's ever been a serious driver for me, just because it's just you can count your beans, and that can be a way of keeping score, and that can be fun. But I was literally just talking about this morning with Ben when we were rucking. It was like we were out on this ruck and we were just talking about just different motivations, and it's such an interesting point. With that, as I talked to you a little bit before we were filming, because this is a question that I find so fascinating. If someone reaches sort of that proverbial finish line of they've reached their motivation, I'm going to give just a very simple hypothetical example. Let's say someone is motivated by, it's actually hard to find a finish line with motivation. If they're motivated by X and they achieve X, do their motivations shift, or do they continue to if their moral compass is really aligned with their motivation, do they just get more refined and push it to the more extreme, to the more extreme, to the more extreme to satisfy that emotion? Do they self-destruct when they reach that motivation because it's over? Do they pivot to a different motivation that's within the same vertical? Do they, what do you see? And again, we may not have a solid answer for it, but it's just an interesting question.
Yeah, no, it really is. I think as long as you're introspective.
Yeah.
And you should be questioning what's driving you. You should discover what it is. And if you thought you had a goal and you reached the goal, and you're like, it's not satisfying. So what's going on inside? What am I being driven by?
Yeah.
What's sustainable? In a good way. Really, I genuinely believe that you should be, there should be morality in what you're doing.
Yeah.
That you should be making the world a better place.
Yeah.
So if you find yourself, and it used to be a cliche, people on Wall Street in the 80s, supposedly, all they want to do is be worth $1 million by the time they were 30.
Yeah.
And it doesn't sound like a lot of money now, but it was back then. Got to be worth $1 million. And then, they get there and then they're like, my life has lost its meaning.
Yeah.
What's next? What do you really believe in? Astronauts, theoretically the guys that walked on the moon. And they come back and they're like, there's nothing left for me to do.
Yep.
And they had a tremendous amount of psychological problems as a result. So if you hit that moment when you reach your goal, no matter how astronomical it should be, your reaction to it should be a moment of introspection. And if it's disappointing, take that as a cue to get better.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Because you think about what's driving you, and it's like your whole life is, I guess it's the existential crisis that people have when they're in the midlife crisis, right? It's like you've achieved your red convertible BMW, and now what, right? So it's
exactly,
and it's the more that you externalize it to something material, probably the bigger problem that you have. But I think people go through their entire life having a fixation on something that they believe to be their motive that isn't really their motive and doesn't necessarily align with their moral compass or their values. And I think if you truly do find, it's cliche, again, if you find what you love and you find what sincerely aligns with your moral compass, and as you know, your subconscious is formed by the time you're 7, so sometimes you have to go back to being a kid, right?
Yeah.
What made you happy? And the next question with that is sort of, do you think that since fear of loss, and loss is such a strong motivator, is the drive for achievement and motivation, it's still not as strong as the fear of losing something, right? So do you think the push from something you're afraid of is stronger than the pull from something you're trying to achieve?
Depends upon how you program yourself.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit earlier about the amygdala and some other stuff. Our default human nature wiring is to be negative and to be driven by fear of loss. You can program yourself out of that, but you also got to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
It's conditioning or it's hygiene. I usually most often use the analysis of hygiene, but it's also conditioning. Look, I brushed my teeth yesterday. Does that mean I got to do it again today? Yeah, because your default biochemical response is you're going to lose oral hygiene if you don't address it every single day.
Yep.
And then you will stay healthy if you pay attention to it every single day.
Yeah.
So, yeah, pay attention to it.
Yeah.
Continue to engage in the conditioning, because if you don't, the default biomechanisms are going to kick into gear and they're going to work in against you.
Yeah, interesting. And there's a lot of evidence about neuroplasticity and being able to get the brain to change. And it takes a while, and now we're seeing it's very, again, bio-individual. Like some people might take longer to develop that change. And again, it kind of comes back to that canyon thing, right? Like this neural pathways. Initially, it's like a trickle of water running through a canyon, and then a million years later, it's the Grand Canyon, right? That's almost your neural pathways and your thought patterns and how quickly you go to a certain thing. And
I got to interrupt. I am so sorry, but I got to do this to you.
You're good.
I'm going to embarrass you in front of everybody.
That's fine.
Or not, or you're going to embarrass me. Have you ever seen me do this thing?
No.
All right, put your right forefinger out. Put your left thumb up.
Okay.
Left thumb.
But, sorry. Is this how you're going to embarrass me? I can't even get my left and right hand.
Now switch. Switch back. Now, that was a neuroplasticity exercise.
Okay.
And you did it much faster than I expected, which really bothers me. Because once I caught you, then bang, you were bang on. So your neuroplasticity is good.
Yeah.
But, and one of the things that you mentioned, it goes dormant as we get older. It doesn't go away. So, which means that no matter how bad your neuroplasticity is, you could wake it back up. We don't lose it, it goes to sleep.
That's interesting.
And so everything that you're about right now is about keeping your neuroplasticity awake, which was why you adjusted really fast.
I just can't figure out left and right. That's a different problem.
But you got it, with that initial mistake, I didn't actually think you were going to be able to
it's like
do it quick.
Pat your head and rub your stomach.
You got it really fast.
Yeah.
But the neuroplasticity issue is we don't lose it, it goes dormant.
That's so interesting. Yeah, this is where I get exceptionally interested in the world of like ketones, gene expression, all this. This is literally why I do what I do now. Is because I'm so fascinated.
I'm going to be super rude and interrupt you again. What was the negotiation technique I just used on you?
I don't know. What would it be called?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I knew I was going to do something that was going to risk embarrassing you on camera.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want you to be embarrassed. This is a potential negative moment that I know is coming. Mm-hmm. I could have said, I don't want to embarrass you. Instead, I said, I'm going to embarrass you. And you weren't embarrassed. And the pain science is very similar. If the doctor is getting ready to give you a shot and he just jabs you with it and you get hit with the pain unexpectedly, you probably get upset.
Yeah.
If the doctor says this is gonna hurt, this is really gonna hurt, and he jabs you and you're like, it was nothing. That's exactly what I did a moment ago.
And it's funny because in the moment that you said that, I automatically appreciated it. It was interesting. I mean, if I really think about it, even when you say, I'm going to embarrass you, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, that's a thoughtful thing to say. Like, he's going to put me on the spot, but he's going to do it. He's, hey, I'm going to ruin your life. Just so you know, I'm just going to ruin your life. It's something is satisfied there. I could feel it, and maybe people that are more aware of that can feel that. But had you said, you set an expectation that I didn't think that I could, especially for me being a performance-minded person, if you had set an expectation differently, being like, let me see if you can do this, or something, it probably would have put me in maybe I wouldn't have been able to do it, right? Maybe you put my mind at ease because you said, okay, no, now it's a challenge.
Well, now we're talking about it too. You retain your mental agility in the moment.
Yeah.
Because you adjusted on that really fast.
Yeah. Interesting. That is fascinating stuff. That's, this is exactly why I wanted to have you on, so that we can, these kinds of discussions and where, again, there's nothing concrete to say that nutrition is going to have an interplay here, but we know that it does, right? Nutrition being fuel.
You can't ignore it.
Yeah, it's, so bringing this back full circle before we do wrap up, do you know, are there things being implemented now in, the position that you were in before? Are they focusing on nutrition, or is it still, because I notice, and I don't want to put the Bureau on the spot, I don't want to put anybody on the spot with this, but I notice by and large throughout multiple different industries, even in professional sports, especially in professional sports, race car driving, Formula One, why is there not this focus on cognitive nutrition, and why is it not there? Are you seeing some focus start to develop there though?
I'm just now starting to get back in touch with the people in the FBI hostage negotiation world. There's a guy who wants to do a study connecting emotional intelligence with ability to perform under pressure. So I'm a little disconnected from them at the moment.
Yeah.
I imagine there's some, but not enough.
Yeah.
You know, when we were talking earlier, we were talking about the guys on a hostage rescue team.
Yeah.
You know, the Bureau's version of the SEALs,
Yeah.
Tier 1 response, civilian, against terrorism. There's no way they're not. There's no way they're not. I don't even have to be talking to them to know those guys are doing that because they're so performance-minded.
Yeah.
Now, how much of the rest of that is spilling into the rest of the Bureau, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm looking forward to finding out because now, you know, I've been away long enough, you know, that they're a little more comfortable with talking to me now. I've been on the private sector and I've maintained my morality, and you know, you never know what somebody's really going to do when they spin out of government.
Yeah.
You know, are they going to turn into something that you can no longer be affiliated with because they lost their morality along the way?
Yeah, no, you've done a very good job with that. That's what I've always kind of respected about you, is you've strayed true to who brought you to the dance in the first place.
Yes.
And I feel like that's a very important thing, right? It's like even with my channel, I can bring this back anecdotally, you know, my channel really started heavily talking about keto and fasting, and as my experience and my research has grown, and I've been involved with different research groups and academic groups, and you know, I realized that, okay, well, I don't want to be so tunnel vision. I want to be able to have this widespread look, right? Sometimes I catch flack for that because I'm not just talking about keto and fasting anymore, but I'm always giving a thoughtful nod to who brought me to the dance in the first place. And that's why even with this conversation, I do bring it back in there, because I also understand, even from a viewer perspective, like if you completely abandon what did bring you somewhere and giving credit to the powers that be for what put you into that, I think there's a karma equation there too. You always, who brought you where, what brought you where, stay true to your colors, and it comes back to everything we've been talking about, even from your moral compass as a kid. Like, what brought you to where you are, and what brought you to a specific thought process, and gratitude for getting to that way of thinking.
Amen.
You didn't just magically wake up that way overnight. It wasn't just this amazing gifted talent that you woke up with. You got there, and being able to recognize how you got there, I think is so just imperative.
Agreed. Yeah, I agree 1,000%. Like, even when you learn from people that maybe you wouldn't associate with them anymore, or maybe you now have a different point of view, I always want to give credit to the people I learned from.
Yeah. I mean, you look at even nutrition now, right? Compared to 50, 60 years ago, right? We talk about, I don't know if you know who Ansel Keys is. Ansel Keys is probably a name fairly known on this channel, is the person that developed the K rations for, so he was like the one that was very big on fats are bad, saturated fat is bad. It's all about how do we carb load our troops, how do we carb load the, so we send them overseas with quick, efficient, ultimately refined carbs and quick energy. And it changed the paradigm and kind of built the food guide pyramid to what it is now, which most people that are nutritionally aware know that the food guide pyramid isn't exactly what we are following anymore, or should be following. But I say that with a grain of salt, right? Or a grain of carbohydrate.
Pun intended.
You can tell I'm a dad, right? My point in saying that is we still have to give credit where credit is due, and I think that is where a lot of society really just lacks the, somewhat even tactical empathy, but just wholehearted empathy to understand of meeting people where they were at, and meeting people where they are at. And Ansel Keys at the time, I sincerely don't think that he was setting out to destroy the world and to cause obesity. Like, and some people will say that he was the reason of that, right? I don't believe that. I don't think that was his goal, right? I think his goal was very fundamental, very practical in terms of how do we fuel people. We know that glucose is fuel. There's little evidence surrounding ketones as a fuel for people that were not epileptic. So what do you do with it? Now we flash forward 60, 70 years later, and you can't just rain on the guy completely, because you have to understand and meet him where he was at, right? And that's also what brought us to the dance in the first place, because if we hadn't had those difficult discussions and those difficult situations, as terrible as it's been with the rise of diabetes and metabolic issues, we wouldn't be where we're at today. And people don't want to necessarily recognize it, but there is a pretty big shift happening, even at a higher level, in terms of how we look at food right now. The younger generations are much more aware of what they're putting in their body. And I say this, and Ethan Supley and I talked about this, was even say what you want about even with a younger generation being a lot of vegan minded, one thing that I will say, at least they are thinking about what they're putting in their mouth. So at least there's some cognition there. And my point with all of that is simply we give a thoughtful nod to what brought us there. And that is how you have true gratitude. Have gratitude for those situations to be able to grow from it and expand.
Yeah, agreed. I completely agreed. And sort of going back and lynching someone over information that they didn't have at the time is a ridiculous thing.
I totally agree. So, well, Chris, we'll wrap it up here. I know you've got some important stuff to go do, as always, but where can people find you? And I'll link out to his book, of course, but where can people find you?
All right, so the best avenue is going to be very self-interested. We like people to subscribe to our newsletter, the Negotiation newsletter, because it is a gateway to everything.
Okay.
So there's a text-to-sign-up function for people who are inside the United States. I'm sure not everybody in your audience is in the United States. But you text Black Swan method, spaces between the words, text it to the number 33777, 33777, Black Swan method, 3 words, not cap sensitive. The website is blackswanltd.com.
Okay.
And even if you can text to sign up, we got a lot of free stuff on a website. I mean, we want people to soak up every free thing that we have.
Yeah.
You know, buy the book, which is a minimal investment, a lot of free stuff. You get a long way just on that.
Yeah.
Then when you're ready to raise the level of your game, especially if you're in the newsletter, which is concise, only one article, actionable, usable information comes in on Tuesday mornings. Then if you get a notification about a training we're doing or a program we're offering and you want to bite on that, if and only if, when you're ready for that, then take it to the next level.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's kind of it's a good philosophy too. I firmly believe in, you know, if you put a lot of good information out there for free, then it comes back in spades. It absolutely does. And and that's, again, something I've always appreciated about you, not only with your book, but just with everything you do in general. So
Thanks.
Everyone, make sure you give him a follow. I know he's also on Instagram as well, but check out his newsletter, sign up for his newsletter.
And by the way, forgive me, there's a Chris Voss out there, at Chris Voss on Instagram. That is not me. I am the FBI negotiator. You will annoy him if you follow him and look for negotiation advice.
Or Chris.
I can't help it. We're both born with the same name. You know, I apologize. I have the same name as you. But on Instagram, I'm at the FBI Negotiator.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks for having me, man.
You bet, man.